At first, in real terms, the deflator is then superimposed on that to get the nominal values. So it's the other way around for at least 55%. So it is not as if nominal number of 8.8 is calculated, and because the deflator is 1% instead of 2 or 3%, we got an exaggerated 7.8%. That is not true. So there is real activity, economic activity, that is driving this momentum, and not just the price levels being on the lower side. And that brings me to the point I want to make, which is that post-COVID, India has been probably the only country in G20 to have grown at this rate for the last 4 years, from 21-22 until 24-25, and it continues. In fact, early indications for the second quarter, based on data we have for July and August, it seems that the growth numbers are looking up quite good even for the second quarter of July to September. In other words, it is possible that we may be underestimating the impact of all the structural reforms, topic of the session today. We may be underestimating the impact of all the structural reforms that have already unfolded under this government in the last 11 years. Whether it is the improvement in physical infrastructure, the advent of digital infrastructure, the various measures that have been taken over the years to move the small and medium enterprises from fragmentation to formalization, and also the ease of doing business, apart from the structural reforms such as the insolvency code, the goods and services tax, the Real Estate Regulation Act, the capitalization and consolidation of public sector banking, and of course the response to COVID, which was targeted, time-bound, and calibrated. Now you take all these together, there is a possibility, and I think we need to increasingly recognize the possibility that our domestic reforms may have already provided a kind of cushion that India would need in the coming years and decades, given the challenging geopolitical environment that may stay with us for quite some time to come. In other words, I think we may have already built in a certain resilience to global factors, the structural reforms that have been undertaken, and therefore we may be more positively surprised by growth outcomes than being negatively surprised by growth outcomes, regardless of the time and the path it takes for the current tariff uncertainties to dissipate, which I hope will dissipate sooner rather than later. So the first point I want to make is the structural reforms of the last 10 to 11 years are beginning to deliver in terms of growth outcomes and employment outcomes as well. The other silver linings we have in the economy, not only the recent GST rate reductions and process reforms, including on registrations, dispute settlement, ease of compliance, etc. This comes on top of the direct tax significant cuts which were announced in the February budget. The income tax bill simplification that got the assent of the parliament, and this is the third one that has been undertaken this year. Because in many a situation, the ease of doing business issues and concerns predominantly center on tax authorities, tax processes, and tax compliance related issues. We know that the journey ahead is still very long when it comes to these matters, but what you see in terms of evidence from the government's determination is to address the tax related matters much more expeditiously than in many other areas, because they happen to constitute the most important touch point for businesses, both domestic and foreign. And we also got, very importantly, in the last few weeks, and that may have gotten a little bit buried under the avalanche of news and developments that are happening elsewhere, is a first credit rating upgrade in 30 years. We moved from BBB minus to BBB as per Standard & Poor. And if anything, if you look at the cost of borrowing for the government of India for a 10-year loan, Barely 11 years ago, we used to pay around 9%. The government of India used to be able to borrow at 9% rate per annum for 10 years. Now the yield is 6.4% for 10 years. And that is a reduction of about 2.6 percentage points on average. And not only that, the extra premium, the spread between the Indian 10-year and the United States 10-year has come down to around where we are today at 240 or 230 basis points. And the number used to be 600 basis points. Now, obviously, when the government of India's borrowing cost comes down, it is natural that other interest rates in the economy also decline commensurately, because the government of India's borrowing cost is the benchmark. And therefore, that is an important structural reform that is not very well appreciated, which is the ability to maintain fiscal prudence and fiscal stability amidst the challenge of the COVID pandemic, the security environment in the region, etc. The government of India promised to bring down the fiscal deficit from 9.2% to less than half in 5 years, and we delivered on it. And as the Honorable Finance Minister told us in the last few days, as she mentioned in the last few days, we will be able to deliver on the 4.4% fiscal deficit ratio this financial year as well. And that is a very important contribution that the government can make apart from many other structural reforms. It is to continue to stay on the path of fiscal stability and fiscal prudence, maintaining macroeconomic stability, and which is what provides the underlying foundation for economic activity to expand over the years in terms of voluntary exchange between the private sector players. Because at the end of the day, economic activity is largely driven by voluntary exchange between private sector participants, between the public and the businesses, and between businesses and businesses. The other important contribution that the government of India has made, although it might have attracted unwanted scrutiny from different players in the world, we have been able to deliver stable and low energy prices in the last 4 years, despite the turmoil going on in the world. And these low energy prices are also an important component of why our growth has been resilient and have tended to surprise on the positive side in the last 4 to 5 years. So these are the current silver linings that we need to remember: the tax reforms, the credit rating upgrade, and the low cost of capital, low and stable energy price, commitment to fiscal stability, etc., or the structural reforms that have already delivered. Now, in the next few minutes, I would like to dwell upon the structural reforms that we need to do going forward. What drives growth? In two simple words: competitiveness and innovation. These are the two things that drive economic growth in the long run. Because innovation is the bedrock of productivity, and competitiveness is the underlying ingredient for maintaining quality that will boost not only exports but also domestic production. So productivity is the key to competitiveness and innovation. And therefore, the importance of the structural reforms that the government of India is embarked on, and you might have seen this in the papers in the last 1 month or so, there are two groups of ministers looking at deregulation. There are two high-level committees, one focusing on deregulation and one focusing on Viksit Bharat under the former cabinet secretary. And under the current cabinet secretary, there are state-level deregulation reforms that are already being undertaken since the early part of 2025. Why is regulation very important in terms of driving growth prospects forward? Is ultimately we speak about it in terms of ease of doing business. The real motive or the real purpose is we need to reduce the cost of being honest. Regulation in India, rules, regulations, compliances, etc., have raised the cost of being honest. Therefore, prompting many businesses, micro, small, medium, and big, to take shortcuts in order to avoid and not to pay the cost of being honest. Therefore, the importance of the current momentum or the thrust on deregulation in the government, and it is not happening just in the wake of the tariff-related external uncertainties. It was a promise made in the budget itself in February 2025 that we will embark on deregulation both in the non-financial sector and in the financial sector. So in other words, these important structural reforms are about facilitating economic activity between people and to improve the ease of being honest. And that is the most important structural reform that the government of India and governments around the country, including state governments, will be pursuing and will hope to deliver to the public in the coming years. And what is it that it takes on the part of the private sector to be able to complete its leg of structural reforms? I said productivity is the key to competitiveness, innovation, export growth, and sustaining long-term economic growth. That means that cost of primary and intermediate goods have to be reasonable and fair, and that doesn't burden downstream industries. Of course, you would point out that, yes, GST rates which are inverted and import duties which are inverted, in other words, higher duties on primary and intermediate goods and lower duties on finished goods, those are the components that need addressing on the part of the government. And in fact, in the GST reforms announced last week, those aspects are being addressed, and inverted duty structures on specific sectors, import duties have been addressed or have begun to be addressed in the last two budgets as well. But where the private sector comes in is large enterprises that operate in the upstream areas have to be mindful of their demands and preferences for protection, have to be mindful that those demands do not raise the cost of doing business for downstream industries, especially small and medium enterprises. Because protection is about maintaining your share of the economic activity. Productivity is about expanding the pie itself, is about expanding not just is about expanding the base, which is the underlying economic activity and economic growth. Whereas seeking to protect your market share keeps the pie from expanding as vigorously or as much as it could do so. So when we talk of structural reforms, one of the important structural reform that is needed on the part of the private sector is to reflect on the kind of tendency we have to ask and seek protection with a view to maintaining one's market share or expand, rather than seeking to expand the underlying pie of the economy itself. And even if our share remains stagnant or even goes down, because if the pie becomes much larger, the absolute take for everybody will increase. And that is a structural reform that the private sector has to contemplate on. Or a second best world is where the protection is necessary or desirable because of global context, because somebody is competing on many other grounds which are not necessarily fair and transparent, and therefore we need to protect our investments, our capacity, etc. The protection has to be in return for productivity. One of the reasons that Northeast Asia, in comparison to South Asia or Southeast Asia, one of the reasons Northeast Asia has moved from being third world to first world within a generation or two, starting from the 1960s, is that they allowed protection to large enterprises in return for productivity and performance and for external benchmarking. That is why you have Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, initially led by Japan, have a global presence and have global brand names than companies from Southeast Asia, for example. So in other words, where we seek protection, we also need to show and tell the public and the government that there is a skin in the game for those who seek protection, and that they will deliver productivity and commitment to quality, innovation, and being competitive in the global arena. And such protection, therefore, cannot be in perpetuity. And the protection has to be, therefore, defined, time-bound, and in return for productivity and export performance. That is the second important dimension of structural reform that we have to keep in mind on the part of the private sector. The next one, and I will stop with that, is because one can go on this topic for the whole day, and I'm sure that we will still not reach a conclusion. It is about the impact of technology, artificial intelligence, and balancing it with the need to create jobs in a demographically rich economy such as ours. We have estimated that 8 million jobs have to be created. You may think that I'm being inconsistent because in one breath I have spoken about productivity, and in the second breath I speak about importance of creating jobs and balancing the deployment of technology versus labor deployment. It is not. It is not inconsistency. Both are compatible, because ultimately what matters is the horizon over which we optimize our decisions. In the very short run, there is a trade-off between the two in terms of technology deployment and labor deployment. But in the medium run, there is no trade-off. And if we pursue one at the expense of the other, the benefits will not fructify, because for businesses to operate, it is not only important to have policy stability, fiscal or macro, etc., or monetary policy, but it's equally important to have social stability. And in a large country such as ours, with a huge demographic, young demographic profile, it is important to pay attention to social stability, not as an act of public interest, but as an act of enlightened self-interest on the part of businesses. And that is why being very mindful of how soon, how fast, and how much we use technology, not to displace labor, but to augment and facilitate labor productivity, is the other most challenging structural reform that the private sector has to keep in mind. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, what I would say is structural reforms are like a ballet, or it's a two-sided partnership. The government is very mindful, or even I would say the governments in the country are mindful of what they need to do. And I can assure you that the focus is on continuing to ensure that we make it easier for businesses, whether they are coming from overseas or homegrown, etc., are able to undertake economic activity without fear or favor. At the same time, structural reforms are a two-sided game, and it's important to keep the focus on productivity and expanding the pie and keeping the balance between technology and labor in a manner such that it is not socially disruptive. That is the structural reform dimension that the private sector has to be mindful about. I thank the AIMA. I thank Mrs. Sunita Reddy for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts, and I wish you all a wonderful day of productive deliberations and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nageswaran, for sharing this powerful perspective.
So we have a question from the audience. Dr. Nageswaran, do we have any labor reform agenda that we are looking at right now?
Labor is a concurrent subject. Although the 4 labor codes are being implemented at varying speeds by different governments around the country, you may have seen, and I did mention in my remarks, that state-level deregulation activities have been underway since the beginning of the calendar year. And you might have seen in the papers that different state governments are relaxing the restrictions on women participating in some areas of vocation that have hitherto been prohibited or excluded for them to participate in because they were once deemed dangerous vocations. Those things are being relaxed. Overtime rules and restrictions relating to overtime are being relaxed. And the creation of third shifts and the duration of shifts themselves are being relaxed, etc. So in other words, you may not have a front page banner headline on labor reforms, but I can assure you that different states are pursuing them at their own speed, keeping in mind the political economy and the social context. It's equally important, I think, for the discourse also to keep in mind that, as with many things, that there is a trade-off between the rights of those who have a job and the right to have a job. There is a trade-off between the two. And I think it's important that labor reforms are not seen as a sort of a measure or set of measures against labor rights, but it is about balancing, as I said, the rights of those who have a job and the rights of others who don't have one to have one. So this balancing act has to be kept in mind. And as I said earlier in my remarks, it is, again, a tango that both governments and the private sector have to do in terms of labor reforms, because many of those labor reforms need not necessarily be required if the private sector were able to create the flexibility, keeping in mind the interest of existing employees and prospective employees.
Thank you. The next question is, how much will the net impact on GDP be due to the GST reduction? That's his first question. And I think the second question is the tariff increase. What will be the impact of the tariffs, new tariffs on GDP?
I think in the last couple of weeks I have spoken about this, but honestly, trying to be very precise about the quantitative impact of either the tariff or the GST is definitely fraught with a wide margin of uncertainty. It's very easy to give you the direct impact. That is, most people have done, looking at, for example, on the tariff side, looking at the export to the US, it's shared in the overall exports, it's shared in the GDP, and you make some assumptions about the elasticity of demand, and because the price goes up for the importer, and therefore, what will be the reduction, potential reduction in the exports, and what percentage of that, what percentage of GDP is that, and then you subtract that number, you get some estimate. Although you must remember that for the first 5 months of the current financial year, exports to the US have almost already achieved, exports of goods have already achieved half the number of last year. So in other words, in this financial year, the impact may be relatively limited depending on the assumptions one makes. But the more important thing is the second and the third round effects of the uncertainty of tariff, provided they last longer, and I hope they don't, because I've always said in the last couple of weeks that my hope is that the tariff situation turns out to be transient and short-lived rather than long-lived. But in the event that it is slightly longer than we want it to be, last longer than we want it to be, the basic, especially the penal tariff of 25%, then the second and third round effects will become more pronounced, which is the uncertainty with respect to investments, capital formation, overall sentiment in the economy. But that is where the GST reforms will play a very good offsetting role. Because by substituting domestic demand for whatever the export demand that may not materialize from the United States, what GST reform does is to alleviate the second and third round effects by creating domestic demand and therefore removing the uncertainty which will come in the way of capital formation. So the GST's contribution is again not just in the direct impact in terms of its purchasing power it places in the hands of the people by bringing down the prices of goods, which of course the private sector has to pass on. But more importantly, what it does is to provide an antidote to the second and third round uncertainty effects. So net-net, I think if you take the GST into consideration, the impact of tariffs and the GST, the compensating effects of GST rate reductions and process reform could probably give us a 0.2 to 0.3% on a net basis in terms of drag on the GDP estimates that we have of 6.3 to 6.8 for the current financial year. And in the next financial year, it's very difficult to say, and I hope we don't have to discuss tariff uncertainties for the next financial year. And by then, I hope it would have become part of history.
So the next two questions, I'm going to club them together. How do we accelerate GDP coming from contribution from agriculture? And I think as part of this question, there is another question which says that what is the government, what steps are they taking to improve the GDP contribution from agriculture, and also how the efficiency of water for irrigation?
Yeah, no, fair questions. I think in the last couple of budgets post government coming back to office in June 2024, there is a focus on agriculture reforms in the, there's a mission announced to take up farming productivity in 100 districts. There is an edible oil mission that has been created, pulses, self-sufficiency in pulses, and many climate-resistant seed varieties have been released to the public. And also, we have set up centers of excellence for applications of artificial intelligence to boost agricultural productivity. It is a state-level subject, as you all know very well, and therefore these initiatives have to be supplemented by states as well. And the point about irrigation, I think, yes, we need to, increase the irrigation cover of agriculture. And in that, we need to restore the balance between surface water irrigation and groundwater irrigation, which has moved so much towards groundwater, which is not a good thing. And that is where I think micro initiatives, again, not just from the government side, but from the private sector side, in terms of restoring water bodies, in terms of not constructing over water bodies, and in terms of rainwater harvesting, these are initiatives that can be undertaken both by the government and by the private sector, both for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. Apart from that, agriculture still has room to contribute at least 0.5 to 0.7% more to GDP growth. And that is a function of basically giving farmers the rights to be able to sell to whomsoever, whatsoever, wherever, and whenever. That is the kind of freedom that farmers need, much more than agricultural subsidies, and some element of insurance, given that their business is inherently prone to the ravages of nature and uncertainties, some amount of meaningful insurance which protects the downside without necessarily distorting incentives. And more than that, empowering farmers and not imposing restrictions on their ability to tap the market signals from within India or overseas. These would unleash the productivity in agriculture, bring it down to at least the global averages, and add to about 0.5 to 0.7% to GDP growth.
So the next question is on skilling, Mr. Nageswaran. When will we catch up with reform and enable skilling so that we'll be ready for a new world with new technologies? The last part is on skilling. Yeah. It says, when will we start formally skilling our people so they will be ready to adopt the new technologies?
No, I think, again, I don't think it is a question of when will we start, because the efforts are very much underway. Because again, I come back to the last two budgets where were announcement about international centers of excellence in skilling in collaboration with Singapore. It's already been announced and the process is underway. And if you look at the kind of skilling initiatives that Odisha has taken, in fact, if you go to Tirupur, the textile manufacturers say that Odisha workers command a premium because their productivity is higher. And the last 7 years between 2016 and 2023, the Odisha Skill Development Authority has created such a wonderful ecosystem that their workers command a productivity premium among employers. And what is encouraging is that several states have made a pilgrimage to Odisha to understand what Odisha has done in the last 6 to 7 years under the guidance of Mr. Subrata Bagchi. And by the way, I would recommend his latest book, When the Chariot Moved, which came out in August. It's a very good read. And it is When the Chariot Moved is the title of the book. And again, consistent with the theme of my speech, there is much that can be done by the private sector as well. So I think skilling is important. And union government has set up many skilling missions, not just with respect to the traditional vocations, but also with respect to artificial intelligence, the 5 centers of excellence, and in quantum computing areas. And recently, the National Small Industries Corporation completed 70 years of existence. And we had an opportunity to visit their Okla center. And it's impressive that from sewing and fixing buttons on garments, all the way to teaching youngsters to handle artificial intelligence control machines and learning how to service white goods, smart white goods, etc. A whole range of skills is being imparted to youngsters under the National Small Industries Corporation, which also incidentally doesn't operate with any budget support from the government, but mainly through its skilling fees and resources it generates. So I think, again, skilling is a tripartite initiative, union, state governments, and the private sector. And more importantly, apart from the focus on education and skilling, as has been my refrain in the last 2 economic surveys, equally important to make sure that our youth are physically and mentally healthy as well. Without that, education and skilling will not yield us the productivity that we are hoping for.
Such a good answer. When do you think RBI is ready for devaluation, for dollar devaluation on the current account?
I'm not sure I get the question.
Yes, I think it's a connection.
Can I see it? Yeah.
So,
to be honest with you, I'm not very sure I understand the question. First of all, the dollar depreciation that we have witnessed in the last few months is something that has happened in the past as well. Between, let's say, for example, 1989 until 1995, and once again between 2001 and 2008 until before the crisis, global financial crisis. And of course, since then, it has been a very long period of either dollar stability or dollar strength, actually. So these cycles usually happen on a sort of a 7-year frequency, broadly speaking. But this time around, the dollar strength has taken a much longer time. It has lasted for more than 12 to 13 years or even longer, particularly after the global financial crisis ended. So dollar has been largely stable to stronger against the global basket of currencies. And therefore, it has commenced a new spell of depreciation. Whether it amounts to dollar devaluation or not is something that we cannot judge right now. And definitely the central bank is paying attention to the trends in global currencies. And there isn't a very viable alternative to the US dollar at this point, and it may take even a much longer time to emerge if it does. So the central bank, I am aware, is consciously keeping an eye on keeping its portfolio of foreign exchange reserves on a diversified basis. I'm sure you have been reading in the papers in the last few years that RBI also has increased its share of gold purchases, etc. So there is a constant attention being paid to the composition of the foreign exchange reserves, including gold.
Just want to ask you this because I've heard it in other forums. Are we looking at an alternative currency to the dollar?
No, certainly not. I think India is not India is not part of any such initiative.
So that's, this question I think covers a lot. It says, Vikshit Bharat, the vision envisages $30 trillion economy by 2047 by avoiding the middle class trap in reference to overall GDP. How is this going to avoid the middle class trap?
Okay,
But I think the
middle
real
income
thing,
trap or something. Yeah.
yes.
No, I mean, it's a good question. Look, at the end of the day, whether we stay in what is called as a middle income range, which is a range from $4,000 per capita to $11,000 per capita, or we go above that, or stay in this range, is a combination of domestic and external factors, some of which will be beyond our control, some which we can influence. So I think it's very important, not only from the point of view of maintaining our mental sanity, etc., is to focus on what are the things that are under our sphere of influence and to work on them. So what kind of outcomes that result will depend on a whole host of factors which we cannot control, not all of them. That is why I said the focus has to be on productivity, on competitiveness, on innovation, investment in R&D, taking care of both skilling and emotional mental health aspects, and for the governments around the country to take care of the ease of being honest, etc. If we do all these things consistently, not just sporadically, then I think we will enhance the chances of us not being trapped in the middle income range between $4,000 and $11,000. Our track record should give you cause for encouragement. We were just a $300 billion economy in 1993, and as of March 2025, we were a $3.9 trillion economy, 13x increase. And we have managed to do it with a much more efficient use of capital than other countries which may have galloped far ahead of us in terms of GDP numbers alone. So our track record should give you cause for encouragement that we were not trapped in low income or poor income status. We are a lower middle income country. And the two major initiatives the government of India has undertaken, the Anusandhan National Research Foundation and the Research and Development Initiative Fund, RDIF, both are very important initiatives which will help us scale the technology and the innovation barrier. And these two funds have to be augmented by private sector participation, not only in terms of financial resources, but also in terms of identifying the deep tech areas or the frontier areas where we have to build a strategic strength and indispensability in the world. And now this is where I think a partnership between the two, public and the private sector, is very essential to make sure that ultimately it is competitiveness, innovation, steeped in an ethos of R&D that will prevent us from stagnating in the middle income trap. And that, as with everything else, is a matter of partnership.
That's wonderful. So we're just about to close.
Yeah.
And let me end by saying, I think this partnership that you mentioned, public and private, is really core. On a personal, on behalf of industry, I wish that we had more, investment in research, because that will drive innovation. I think this will be the next challenge for India. But thank you for all your thoughts. You have really showed us the silver lining. While we have many questions, I think Mr. Nageswaran has answers for all of them with his deep study and understanding of the Indian economy. Congratulations on improving the credit rating of India and giving us the stability that we need, the predictability that we need to make sure that FDI continues to come to India and the industry remains vibrant while uplifting the per capita income of all of India. Thank you so much, Mr. Nageswaran.
Thank you very much.